picture chosen to be on the board for today. And hopefully everybody can see it, but if you can't, it reads, "See that over there, son? That was once America, but now it's just a bunch of sissies afraid to hurt each other's feelings." And that because we're going to talk about acting like men today. And that because men were created by God to be the strength or glory of his image in human flesh. We see that in 1 Corinthians 11:7. As such, how men act or portray their manhood is of supreme importance to God and his witness to humanity. Unfortunately, one of the biggest deficits in the world and the church today are men acting like men. This is partly due to the fact that people, including Christians, have largely become ignorant as to God's definition and distinctions. This study will establish that definition and those distinctions. So with no further ado, point number 1, men acting like men is a command and therefore a choice. Again, men acting like men is a command and therefore a choice. So our first text for today, sorry, you guys are still writing, is going to be 1 Corinthians 16. And just in case you need that one more time, men acting like men is a command and therefore a choice. So again, turning to 1 Corinthians 16. And let me just mention while you're turning there, there's going to be a lot that I don't think you're going to be able to write down. I'm hopeful because these are far more pastors' notes than my notes that they will at the very least be sent out so you'll have a copy of them. But so again, just don't worry about writing down too much. But again, 1 Corinthians 16, just verse 13 here. Be watchful, stand firm in the faith, act like men, be strong. And let me just point out, it's very simple, but just one thing. Paul is not here making a suggestion. He's not saying it would be nice if you guys acted like men, or it would be helpful if you guys acted like men. He puts it in the imperative, act like men. And because of that, we know that that's a command. And just like Deuteronomy 30:11, we all know it. We can be obedient. So again, it is a command, and therefore, because it's a command, it is a choice, which means that if we fail in this respect, it is not because we are incapable of acting like men. It is rather that we are choosing not to act like men. And in the Bible, acting like a man is associated with two key Christian virtues. As such, these represent God's definition of manliness and strength, which means if you are not characterized by these two key Christian virtues, you are not acting like a man, no matter what you or the world thinks. And that's, again, another important distinction. There's a lot of things that the world puts value on and emphasis on that they say makes you a man. But at the end of the day, we as Christians, the only thing we should care about is what God defines as manliness. So the first of those two key Christian virtues is courage. And we're sitting tight right here in 1 Corinthians 16:13. So the word translated men, act like men, that word in the Greek is andrizomai, it's the word that we get androgen from, which is the male hormone. It is literally man acting. But the interesting thing about that phrase is it's translated in many places as courage. A good example of that is the Septuagint, which is the Greek rendering of the Old Testament. If you were to go to Joshua 1:6, where we were in journaling not too long ago, where it says, be strong and very courageous, that's the same word, the andrizomai. So that same word translated here as men is also translated courage, which should give you an idea of how often this is actually commanded in the Bible. How often are we told that we are to be courageous? Just take the book of Joshua alone and think about that. So again, courage is associated with manliness. And this is the idea being communicated in both Jeremiah 50:37, or rather in contrast, the idea being communicated, both in Jeremiah 50:37 and 51:30. In both those texts, it talks about the Babylonians. And in 51:30 specifically, it says when they stop fighting and they're now hiding in their strongholds and they're no longer strong, they've lost their strength, they will become women, or they become like women. And the idea is not saying that women cannot be courageous, but rather more the point is that when men lose their courage, they become women. So again, the biblical definition, or not again, but now move into the biblical definition for courage. It's conviction that is aggressively enforced and expressed, even when afraid or opposed by others, including, and I would argue most especially, friends and family. So again, conviction that's aggressively enforced or expressed, even when afraid or opposed by others. And I think we get this weird idea that we can say that we're courageous people, but as soon as things get hard or we face any sort of opposition or we're fearful and we don't succeed in those opportunities, that's not being courageous. That's a failure. And you can't say you're a courageous person if you're not successful in those environments. And in fact, I would say that courage is most often exercised in the face of opposition and fear. So what then courage looks like for the Christian man acting like a man? Well, it's a bunch of things. It's leading by conviction, not by consensus. It's not a popularity contest. Telling people the unvarnished truth about their situation and state versus glossing over it or minimizing it because you don't want to offend or hurt them. Which, how often does that happen? You get into an environment where you do know what's true, and yet you water down what you know to be true because you want it to come off more pleasing to the person. That's not being courageous in this respect. It is, in other words, saying the hard things and the things that are unpopular or may even be offensive because they are the truth and need to be heard. Being courageous for the Christian man even includes using swear words. Why? Because that's what best communicates or describes the situation. In other words, we don't always go out of our way to use swear words, but a good example of this is if a man commits adultery, you don't say to him, "You were a very naughty boy." Does that communicate the severity of the situation even remotely? No way. And if you ask somebody, "Hey, what did so-and-so get disciplined out for?" and they said, "Oh, they were being naughty," and it was adultery, that does not communicate the situation at all. So we don't have a problem with that using stronger language in certain areas, but that's important. Sometimes swear words are what best describe the situation that you're dealing with, and we shouldn't back down from that. It includes also confronting people who are in sin, not shrinking back from conflict, and even going to your pastor or Christian brother when you disagree or have a problem with something they said or did. And that happens a lot. That can even happen here too, is we have this idea that when we have a problem with somebody else, almost like we're causing less damage by not dealing with it. That by avoiding that conflict, that's going to save the relationship down the road, when in fact it's just the opposite. I mean, how often does it happen that the longer we wait, the facts of the situation start to fade, we start to misremember things. And because we didn't deal with them in the first place, that becomes irreconcilable. We can never get on the same page with the other person because we always have different version of the same story. That happens when we don't confront people, when we don't deal with situations like that. What courage also looks like for the Christian man, it includes standing up for Christ and God. It includes defending the true gospel, which includes, by the way, telling people when they hold to a false gospel. And that happens too. We say, "Oh yeah, we definitely shared the gospel with that person." But then when the question's asked, "Well, are they Christians?" and you say no, it's, "Did you ever tell them that they believe in a false gospel?" And you're like, "No, I just shared ours." Well, that's not being courageous. It includes telling people that they hold a false gospel. It includes also sharing God's word with others, even though it may make things difficult or dangerous. That's another example. Thankfully, in the U.S., we don't have a lot of examples of it being of it making things dangerous, but it can definitely make things difficult, can't it? In our workplaces, in school. I mean, sometimes all it takes in a school is sharing the gospel with one person, and because they didn't like it, they go spread that around the whole school, and all of a sudden everybody's looking at you differently. That's the kind of impact that can have, but that's the thing we have to be willing to take. Most especially as men, that's the expectation. It also includes going to war with your family, which includes your children and your wife. And again, going to war with your family over sin and rebellion in the home. And in relation to sin and rebellion in the home, there should be zero tolerance, and it should be totally shut down. And those should be the two principles exercised by every husband and father in relation to their flocks. And who is a husband and father's flock but his wife and his kids? So again, zero tolerance and totally shutting down sin and rebellion. It includes following God's instruction even though it may seem crazy to others, most especially when it comes to leading those under your charge. It's another thing that can happen is we can believe something or take a course of action, and people in the world may think that you're crazy for doing it. It also means that you never chicken out when things get tough doing things God's way. It means that we never should be risk adverse when God gives you an opportunity to speak or act for him. And again, risk adverse. You look at an opportunity, and rather than going for it because God's given you that opportunity, you're instead thinking, what are the potential consequences from this? Is it really worth it for me to speak up in this situation? Just understand, that's not the attitude you're to take in that. It means also never letting your love for others cause you to compromise in your judgment or punishment of them. That can happen too. We can go into discipline meetings, and hey, as long as it's other people's family members or other people's families that we're dealing with, we have no problem raising our hands and, voting on stuff or being good with stuff. And we don't have any questions, but then all of a sudden it comes into our household, and it's our kids or it's our spouse or whoever, and all of a sudden we're confused or we have questions. And that's not to say that that can't be legitimate, but I think it's worth asking yourself the question, are you just finding those questions because now it's somebody that you actually love versus a legitimate question? So again, never letting your love for others cause you to compromise in your judgment or punishment of them. It also means embracing rather than fighting or hiding from biblical change or challenges. And I think especially I can reflect and know that as I get older, I also do not like change as much as I did when I was younger. And I'm sure it probably does not get any better as you get older either. So again, but when it comes to these areas, we should embrace that when it's biblical change and biblical challenges. And I was reflecting on that even with the name change to Christ Covenant Church. I remember there were questions about that, and maybe even, I don't remember if there was really friction around it, but just it seemed like this big change, and here we are years later, and nobody even thinks twice about it. And again, when there's a biblical reason for that change, we shouldn't be scared of that. It also means embracing blind righteousness. It means being aggressive in pursuing Christ and his kingdom. And that's a really good reflection point for the young men in this church right now is that how we're pursuing careers? Is that how we're making career choices? Is it with pursuit and aggressive pursuit of Christ and his kingdom? Or is it just because that's what came up or it's the easiest thing to do? It also means throwing caution and further contemplation to the wind and choosing to submit every single area of your life every single day to Christ's lordship and justice. And again, that happens too. We, rather than throwing caution to the wind and not thinking about it anymore, we take all this time to overthink and think, well, what about all the things I'm going to miss out on if I do this? That's not the right attitude. You cannot say you're a courageous man if you take that sort of approach to it. It also means taking real and honest ownership of your actions and God's expectations of you, most especially as a husband, father, or whatever kind of role. And I say whatever kind of role because that could even be your team lead at Chick-fil-A or manager at a fast food restaurant or anything like that. God's put you in that role, and he's expecting you to act like a man in that role. And again, taking real and honest ownership of your actions. Well, your actions include most especially sin and failure. You cannot say you're a courageous person if you don't take ownership of those kinds of actions. So moving from what that looks like to some biblical examples, I'm just going to name a few, we'll turn to a few, but starting out with Abraham, what do we see in Genesis 12? It's been a long time since we've journaled there, but we see Abraham being commanded to go out from the land that he's used to. He hasn't, as far as I know, been any other place other than where he grew up. And God's telling them, all right, it's time for you to move, for you to go into this foreign country. You don't know what's going to be there. The only thing he really had was God promising that he was going to bless him. But I mean, put yourself in those shoes. We can read that and we know things went well for Abraham, but Abraham didn't know that at the time. He had to take that leap. So put yourself in those shoes. I mean, I grew up in Colorado. Most of us grew up in the U.S. What if all of a sudden we found out we had to move into the middle of South America into a jungle? And the only promise we had was that God was going to be with us. We don't know if the people are going to be hostile, if they're going to try to kill us, if they're going to be friendly. It's that kind of courage that Abraham had to exercise doing that. And as if that was not enough, Genesis 22, 1 through 10, Abraham being told to sacrifice Isaac. And as I was going through a lot of these, I kind of realized and was reflecting on we have the advantage of hindsight. We get to read these verses and be like, oh, but Abraham didn't actually have to sacrifice Isaac. Well, Abraham didn't know that at the time. I mean, put yourself in those shoes. He really thought he was leaving with Isaac in the morning and not coming back with Isaac later that day. And what does he do? He doesn't hide from that. He doesn't resist that. He wakes up early. He cuts wood to make sure that he has what he needs for the sacrifice. So again, Abraham, a great example of this. And there's other examples of Abraham doing the same stuff. But again, having that kind of courage that he may have been fearful in those situations, and yet he dove into them anyway. 2 Kings 15, 1 through 8 is kind of an interesting text. I don't know if you can turn there or not, but I will so I can at least read it. And again, that was 2 Kings 15. The whole section is 1 through 8, just talking about Azariah, his reign in Judah. And he was 16 years old when he began to reign, and he reigned 52 years in Jerusalem. And if you know about the kings, a lot of them did not make it very long, most especially depending on how faithful they were. So 52 years, if I remember correctly, is a pretty decent chunk of time. And you'll notice in verse 3, he did what was right in the eyes of the Lord. But then it also says in verse 4, nevertheless, the high places were not taken away. The people still sacrificed and made offerings on the high places. And verse 5, and the Lord touched the king so that he was a leper to the day of his death. So again, Azariah, he did what was right in the eyes of the Lord. And yet because he did not take this action in relation to the people and what they were doing, his flock, I mean, he had jurisdiction. He was the king. That's the kind of stuff he's supposed to take away. And I don't know this for sure, but what do you think the chances are that it was fear of what people thought? Is it possible that it was the people in Israel being like, well, we want the high places? And Azariah's like, okay, well, I mean, I'm going to do things right, but I guess I'm not going to take that away from him. And what are the chances that that could be true? And God curses him for it. And I think it begs a really interesting question. How many of us, when we determine what we're going to do and what we don't do, how much of our determination is based on what other people are going to think? Because I think, and I mean, that's a thing to be honest with yourself with, because the only way to get better at it is by admitting that that is a problem for you. So again, how much of what other people think or what people will think, how much of that influences your decision making? And again, when it comes to righteousness, it shouldn't. So moving on from that example, we have a couple in Daniel. First in 3:15 through 18, we have Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in front of Nebuchadnezzar. And these are three younger Israelite guys who are basically servants of the king of Babylon. And he has this big statue that he's telling them to worship. And they say, nope, we're not going to do it. So a very, very small minority in a huge amount of people. And these guys are willing to take that kind of stand to be like, nope, we're not going to do it. Even at the threat of being thrown in the furnace. And same thing in Daniel 6, when Daniel now is told that he's not allowed to pray to God anymore. And what does he do? He's like, oh well, still going to do it. And he does. And then he ends up getting thrown in the lion's den. And again, those are two texts that are very easy to read into. And we're like, well, yeah, but they came out of both of them unscathed. They did not know that when they were going into it. They obviously prayed to God that he would spare them. But even in the first example, they even tell Nebuchadnezzar, like, hey, we think we're going to get spared if you throw us in the furnace. But at the end of the day, even if we're not, we're still not going to worship your gods. So again, that's real biblical courage. And I don't know if I gave the verses on the Daniel 6, 7 through 17. Jesus too, Matthew 15, 8 through 14, 16, 21 through 23, the whole chapter of 23, and then Luke 20, 9 through 20. In all of those, we have examples of Jesus not shying away from saying really harsh things to a really wide group of people. One of them includes Peter. Others are the religious leaders, so much so that I believe it's Luke 20, that they actually talk about now wanting to plot against him, lay hands on him, arrest him, kill him, because of the things he says. And they realize they're starting to make the connections of what he's saying against them. And again, Jesus was not worried about that when he was saying that to him. And one text I do want to turn to is John 2. Still going to be dealing with Jesus, but a really awesome text for what we're talking about here. Again, John 2, starting in verse 13. The Passover of the Jews was at hand, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem. In the temple he found those who were selling oxen and sheep and pigeons, and the money changers sitting there. And making a whip of cords, he drove them all out of the temple with the sheep and oxen. And he poured out the coins of the money changers and overturned their tables. And he told those who sold the pigeons, "Take these things away. Do not make my Father's house a house of trade." Then his disciples remembered that it was written, "Zeal for your house will consume me." And again, I'm going to keep on saying it. Put yourself in their shoes. You're in the temple, and this crazy guy comes in and starts flipping tables, whipping people out of the temple. And I don't know if you've ever dropped coins on the floor, but that's really loud and really obnoxious. And he's throwing all these guys' stuff, totally upending it. And do you really think they were all just standing there just oh, I guess this is cool? Surely he faced opposition. I'm sure you can't go into a mall and start flipping people's tables without people having a problem with you. And I'm sure Jesus had that too. They probably thought he was literally crazy. But again, what's Jesus displaying here? It's courage. He had the courage to go in there and do it because he knew it was right. And again, where does that courage come from? And I think that's a legitimate question. You're saying, okay, I need to be more courageous, but I can't picture myself doing that. I'm not that kind of person. Well, where does that courage come from? And notice again what his disciples say. They remembered after he does all this crazy stuff, "Zeal for your house will consume me." It comes from zeal. But what is zeal but conviction? And that's a really, really important thing, because if we don't have conviction, you shouldn't be surprised that you're not a courageous person if you don't believe any of this is real. Why would you have the courage to tell anybody about this or offend people if you don't have the conviction or believe that what we believe is real? And again, that's what gave Jesus the energy to go in there and not care what they think. So again, conviction, super important. Moving on from that example, you have in Luke 22, 35, and 36, you have Jesus kind of sending the disciples back out to spread the gospel. And if you remember, at least in Matthew 10, when he's first sending out the disciples, or the apostles in that case, he tells them, hey, don't pack a lunch. He says, don't take a bag, don't take money, don't take anything. You're going to earn your living on the road. You're going to be supported by the people you're preaching to. But by the time Luke 22 comes around, the world's changed a little bit. It's not exactly as friendly to the followers of Jesus as it was. And in that instance, you actually have Jesus saying, hey, remember that first time I sent you guys out? Did you lack anything? And they said, nope, nothing. He says, okay, well, this time's a little bit different. This time you do need a money bag. This time you actually need a sword, because this time things are going to be dangerous. Putting that in modern vernacular, it's like, oh, you're going to go to that side of town? Well, make sure you have your wallet and your gun, because it's a little bit dangerous out there. And that's what he's telling them. It's very easy to be courageous when you're a rock star. I'm sure the apostles were received very well initially, but this time it's a little bit different. They were to keep spreading the gospel even though it was going to be dangerous this time. And now turning over to 2 Corinthians 4. And just while you're getting there, important to remember about, both Corinthians, but just in general, when Paul's writing to the Corinthians, it's kind of a hostile crowd that he's writing to, most especially in 2 Corinthians. He talks a lot about what the people are saying against him. Not necessarily the whole church, but there are people who are even questioning the legitimacy of his ministry as a whole. So he's not exactly writing to an entirely friendly base here. And he's gone through a lot, even... this is what we were working on in the seminary stuff, was 2 Corinthians 11. And Paul even kind of goes through his resume of all the things he's gone through in chapter 11. He says, Are they servants of Christ? I'm a better one. He's comparing himself now to these guys that are calling him illegitimate. But he says, are they servants of Christ? I'm a better one, with far greater labors, far more imprisonments, with countless beatings, and often near death. 5 times I received at the hands of the Jews the 40 lashes less one. 3 times I was beaten with rods. Once I was stoned. 3 times I was shipwrecked. A night and day I was adrift at sea. On frequent journeys in danger from rivers, danger from robbers, danger from my own people, danger from Gentiles, danger in the city, danger in the wilderness, danger at sea, danger from false brothers, in toil and hardship, through many a sleepless night, in hunger and thirst, often without food, in cold and exposure. And apart from other things, there's the daily pressure of my anxiety for all the churches. So again, he's going through kind of his resume. And it's a good list, but there's other things that he went through too. And 2 things I'll make mention of. Remember Luke 22 that we just talked about. These are the kind of dangers Jesus is sending these guys back out to, and yet they're still to do it. And I think we have this weird kind of American businessman mindset that we should determine how successful we are by how well things are going. And that's true in a lot of instances. Like, if you have a job and you're excelling at your job, then that's probably a good thing. If you're not doing well, then, things aren't going well. Maybe you should look for a different job. But that's not always true. I mean, if we had those kinds of experiences right now, if we had that kind of laundry list of bad things that had happened to us, would we say we were being successful? Or would we be tripped up by that, thinking that maybe something wasn't going right? But again, here we have Paul going through all that. So going back to the verse I mentioned, chapter 4, verse 1. He says, therefore, having this ministry by the mercy of God, we do not lose heart. So again, that's why I brought all that context up. Because Paul's saying, hey man, despite all of this crazy stuff that has happened to us, we do not lose heart. But the thing I love is verse 13. He gives the reason for it. He says, since we have the same spirit of faith according to what has been written, I believed and so I spoke. We also believe and so we also speak. What's Paul telling us right there? I got conviction, which means I can't do anything, I can't help but preach. That is the only thing I can help do because I believe it. So again, what gives Paul the energy to be courageous in the manner that he is? It's again, conviction. If you don't have the conviction, again, there should be no surprise to you that you can't make it in these other environments. So moving on from that, there's just some other examples. Galatians 2:11, if you remember, Paul confronts Peter to his face. Ephesians 4:25, he says to speak truth with your neighbors. Philippians 3:13, 1 Thessalonians 2:1 and 2, 2 Timothy 4:2 through 5, he says, preach in and out of season. Even though people are very soon not going to want to hear it, he says, you're to preach anyway. And then James 5:19 through 20, bring your brother back. And you're going to cover a multitude of sins through that. But again, what does that take? It takes getting in the trenches with people. It takes being willing to confront people over sin. It takes being willing, or rather not backing down from conflict. And I think it's easy, especially me growing up, we have more technology. We don't have to do as much face-to-face interaction, much less confrontation even. And I think it's very easy to not be good at conflict and then not want to get into it more. But again, the only way you're going to get better at dealing with those kinds of scenarios is by being in those kinds of scenarios. It's a very weak mindset to say because I'm not good at something, I'm not ever going to try to do it. Most especially when it's stuff as important as this, confronting people, getting into it like that. So again, all of this, and just to go back to where we started, acting like men is a command, which means if courage is part of that definition, it also is a command. Everything that we just went through is non-negotiable for the men in this body. So again, courage, one of the 2 key Christian virtues. The second of these is loyalty. Again, loyalty. And that's coming from, to start, 1 Timothy 2. And what I'm using to make this point is more by contrast. But 1 Timothy 2, starting verse 12, I do not permit a woman to teach or to exercise authority over a man. Rather, she is to remain quiet. For Adam was formed first, then Eve, and Adam was not deceived, but the woman was deceived and became a transgressor. And what obviously happened there? Obviously, Eve transgressed, but her loyalty should have been to God in such a way that that didn't happen. So again, she was deceived to the point that her loyalty went elsewhere. We also see that back in 2 Corinthians 11. And again, just making the connection, because Eve's loyalty was easily pulled away, that's the connection that Paul's making to say that that's why that she can't teach. So again, 2 Corinthians 11, Paul again making an appeal to try to catch what Corinthians he can. He says, I feel a divine jealousy for you, since I betrothed you to one husband to present you as a pure virgin to Christ. And again, he's saying, I'm jealous for you because your devotion should be only to Christ. Your loyalty should be to Christ alone. But I am afraid that as the serpent deceived Eve by his cunning, your thoughts will be led astray from a sincere and pure devotion to Christ. So again, he's making the point. Eve's loyalty was pulled away from that sincere and pure devotion to Christ. And it's men that are associated with loyalty versus women. In this respect, they're considered the weaker vessel, as we see in 1 Peter 3:7, and cannot function as pastors. This may also be the reason that they are called to remain silent when the congregation is assembled for judgment, as we see in 1 Corinthians 14:34. That because they're easily biased by their emotions. In ancient times, women could not be soldiers, most likely due to the common belief that they were, in general, less trustworthy. And again, stay in the context with me. We're talking about what it means to act like men. That's not to say that women can't be loyal or be courageous or trustworthy or anything. That's not at all saying that. But the point is that men are associated with that loyalty. So again, moving to the biblical definition of loyalty. It is commitment conducive to authority, rank, and institution, opposed to individualism and unaffected by circumstance. Again, commitment conducive to authority, rank, and institution, opposed to individualism and unaffected by circumstance. And I'm just going to turn to it and read it for you, but Job 2 is a great, Job in general is a great example of this. But most especially right towards the start, right after Job has all of his stuff taken away, now even his health is taken away. What I'm going to pick up is verse 9, but the previous verse, he took a piece of broken pottery with which to scrape himself while he sat in the ashes. That's the kind of low of the low that most of us will never even reach. And that's where Job's at. And his wife said to him, do you still hold fast your integrity? Curse God and die. Basically, are you done yet with this God guy? You should curse him and die. But he said to her, you speak as one of the foolish women would speak. Shall we receive good from God, and shall we not receive evil? In all this, Job did not sin with his lips. And the only point I want to make there is just, you see the kind of man that Job was. He's saying, my loyalty is not tied to whether things are going good or bad. My loyalty to God is irrespective of that. God can do whatever he wants with me, which means if things are going bad, I'm still going to be loyal to him. If things are going good, I'm still going to be loyal to him. That part doesn't change. And it's interesting, in Dante's Inferno, the worst of sinners existing at the center or lowest circle of hell are those guilty of treason, betrayal, or disloyalty. These traitors are doomed to spend eternity encased in ice with the very worst of the bunch, including Judas, being perpetually chewed on by Satan. In response to this, the popular blog site Art of Manliness asks and answers this question. With so many varieties of sinner, why did Dante mark traitors as the worst of the worst? In short, why is betraying one's loyalty so unforgivable an act? Because, like courage, loyalty is one of the essential manly virtues. Even the world recognizes the connection between loyalty and manliness or acting like a man. Men are supposed to be loyal. So what then loyalty looks like for the Christian man acting like a man? Well, it's a number of things. It's supporting and defending anyone or anything that is a part of Christ's kingdom or its advancement. It's also never giving up on or abandoning anything or anyone that is a part of Christ's kingdom or its advancement. And that would include the church, i.e. your covenant community, your brothers and sisters in Christ, your pastors, your wife and kids, and even the career you believe Christ wants you to pursue. And a lot of times we don't have a big problem with the wife and kids. I mean, that's kind of just a given. Again, American mindset is like, well, yeah, of course I'm loyal to my wife and my kids. And yet in the church, there's this weird disconnect where people think that that doesn't have to be true about their brothers and sisters or even the covenant community in general. When in fact, it's just the opposite. God expects your loyalty just as much to them as your wife and kids. And again, even the career you believe Christ wants you to pursue, those are the kinds of things you should be protecting to make sure that you are able to accomplish them. What the loyalty also looks like for a Christian man is separating and treating as enemy anything or anyone who is opposing or anathema to Christ's kingdom or its advancement. That includes apostates, heretics, false teachers, false Christians. And again, just to, in case it's a question that pops up, it's like, well, but we're not loyal to like people that go out of the church. And it's like, right, we're loyal to people that stay in the church. We're loyal to the church, which means when people go apostate, that's why our loyalty is no longer to them. And that's not a conflict. And I think it's also worth mentioning, loyalty can absolutely be exercised towards the wrong things. Again, we can have a loyalty to family to a fault, or to kids to a fault, where they go apostate and yet our loyalty to them drags us down. So again, it's important to make those kinds of distinctions. But 2 Timothy 2, 3, and 4 makes mention of suffering as a good soldier and please the one who enlisted him. And again, what are soldiers? They're loyal. But what are they loyal to, if you think about it? For the most part, they, or at least a good soldier, is loyal to the mission, not himself, not even his teammates. He's loyal to the mission and what the command staff or whoever is in charge is trying to make happen. It's pleasing the one who enlisted you. And then moving on to some other texts here. So Matthew 16, these ones there's three here that I do actually want to turn to. It's Matthew 16, starting in 21. From that time, Jesus began to show his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem and suffer many things from the elders and chief priests and scribes, and be killed, and on the third day be raised. And Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him, saying, "Far be it from you, Lord, this shall never happen to you." But he turned and said to Peter, "Get behind me, Satan. You are a hindrance to me, for you are not setting your mind on the things of God, but on the things of man." And if you notice, this came up also with the courage piece, because once again, here's Jesus having no problem ruffling feathers and saying really harsh things to Peter when he's doing something wrong. But notice again, one, Peter's loyalties stray from the agenda or the mission, but Jesus, man, he's laser focused. He's like, look, I'm supposed to die. That's, period. And even remember too, Jesus, as he gets closer to dying, he even asks God, like, is there any way that this burden could be taken away from me? So it's not like Jesus was excited to go die on the cross. At least in that respect, he wasn't excited for the pain that was going to come along with it. So again, he is keeping his mind focused on the mission. And moving on from that text to Acts 20. I'm going to link kind of all three of these together with Jesus being the main guy here. It's Acts 20, verse 28. Paul's talking to the Ephesian elders, and he says, "Pay careful attention to yourselves and to all the flock, in which the Holy Spirit has made you overseers, to care for the church of God, which he obtained with his own blood." And again, the main thing I want to point out is it mentions he obtained the church with his own blood. And again, we obviously know it's Christ's blood that it was Christ that obtained the church with his own blood. So that's Acts 20:28, and then last one is just Philippians 2. Philippians 2, verse 5, "Have this mind among yourselves, which is yours in Christ Jesus, who, though he was in the form of God, did not count equality with God a thing to be grasped, but emptied himself by taking the form of a servant. Being born in the likeness of men, and being found in human form, he humbled himself by becoming obedient to the point of death, even death on a cross." So the point I want to make out of all three of these verses is that Jesus, who is the epitome of manliness and who we should be trying to emulate, Jesus was loyal to the point of death, not only to God, but to a very imperfect church. And again, we're talking about loyalty here. That's why I'm emphasizing the imperfect church, is because think about where Jesus came in in history. It was after a more or less disastrous Israel, tons and tons of rebellion. By the time Jesus is showing up in Jerusalem, it's a super, super bad environment, demon possession all over the place. So that's what Jesus is coming into, I don't know what you want to call it, back cleanup on. And yet Jesus, do you really think that Jesus didn't know that the church was going to be imperfect? Jesus didn't come and take away sin. He knew that there were still going to be imperfections in the church. And yet he was loyal to the point of death, not just to God, but to that very imperfect church. In other words, Jesus saw her as worthy to be served with all his might, soul, and strength. Like Jesus says in Mark 10:45, "The Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve and give his life for many." So that was Jesus, the epitome of manliness. And again, the point is, it's loyalty despite imperfection. So how could we be any less than that? We get caught up in this goofy idea that if we see unfaithfulness in the church or sin in the church that we didn't expect or whatever it is, that all of a sudden our loyalty can fly out the window. And that is totally not at all the example Jesus set for us. Again, loyalty despite imperfection. He was loyal to both God and the church. And again, we think like, oh, well, I'm irritated. I don't like the fact that this person did this to me or whatever. And I mean, I've grown up in this church and I've seen people leave for really, really dumb reasons. And yet, we as men, the expectation is far higher. The bar is set far higher. That's a very shameful thing, and we should be ashamed if that's the example that we set for kids. In Matthew 17, we've looked at this text before, but in light of what we're talking about, it's worth revisiting. Because here in Matthew 17, starting in verse 14, we see something really interesting. When they came to the crowd, a man came up to him and kneeling before him said, "Lord, have mercy on my son, for he is an epileptic and he suffers terribly, for often he falls into the fire and often into the water. And I brought him to your disciples and they could not heal him." How does Jesus respond? Jesus answered, "O faithless and twisted generation, how long am I to be with you? How long am I to bear with you?" Right here we see a very frustrated and irritated man in Jesus. He is upset about the situation, a imperfect, a faithless and twisted generation. And yet, what do we see? Does Jesus quit after that? Is he like, this was more than I was expecting, and he's just like beam me up, Scotty, essentially. No, he doesn't at all. You almost see this like, all right, come bring him to me. Because that's the very next thing that happens. Bring him here to me. And Jesus rebuked the demon, and it came out of him. So again, Jesus, super frustrated, upset about the condition of the faithless and twisted generation, a very imperfect generation, and yet he doesn't quit. His loyalty is still there. And Jesus gives us the manly parameters for when we can stop being loyal, and that's the 7 times 70, i.e., never. So again, we don't get to stop being loyal in this respect. And it's important to draw the distinction too. It's allowing both of these things to exist together. Things can be imperfect, and that doesn't have to drive our loyalty. Those things should be disconnected in that respect. When there's imperfections in the church, when there's failures in the church, that shouldn't mean that we just throw our loyalty out the window. But again, people get that mixed up where they allow their loyalty to be driven and tied to whether things are perfect or not. That's not loyalty. Again, just as courage is most often exercised in the face of fear and opposition, so loyalty is most tested in the face of faithlessness. You can't say you're a loyal person only when things are good. If you've never gone through anything bad and been loyal through that, then at the very least your loyalty's not been tested. And if you fail every single time that comes up, then you are not a loyal person. And again, think of Judgment Day too. Thinking back to those people that have left for dumb reasons, who were not loyal to the church. What are they going to say to Jesus? And if you're the kind of person who's going to end up leaving this church at some point over something like that, what are you going to say to Jesus? Well, there were failures in the church, so I left. It was imperfect. It wasn't, nobody was faithful there or anything like that. Well, what are you going to say to him? Because he's going to be like, well, yeah, but I was faithful to the point of dying there. He gave far more than we ever could. And yet still, he expects us to be loyal. We should be imitating him in that respect. So again, loyalty and courage, those two key attributes that must characterize you if you're going to act like a man. And again, it is not an option. I'll say that over and over and over and over again, because acting like a man is a command, which means it's expected of every single male in this church. To contrast that, acting like a man is not associated with, but rather diametrically opposed to, the following 3 weaknesses or perversions. The first of which is being cowardly. So what this looks like, it's men not consistently pulling the trigger in the home with their family. It's not confronting people or dealing with issues, but instead running away, blowing up, or keeping it all inside and letting bitterness grow. It's men being intimidated by others who are stronger or smarter than them. And just think of Lot. What happened with Lot? He was cowardly in how he led his family. His wife ended up dying, and then he commits incest with his daughters. And even Eli. Eli also was a coward with his sons. We've looked at that text a number of times too. He tells his sons they should stop their rebellion. But remember those 2 principles we said? 0 tolerance and shutting it down? Eli never did that. He never shut down the rebellion, though he did talk to them. So again, being cowardly. And today's version of cowardliness meant to look like manliness or to compensate for manliness, however you want to say it, is machoism and machismo. Again, speaking more about, think about the value that the world puts on different things for being manly. I mean, boys with beards, compensate for lack of manliness by growing facial hair. And that's not to say that facial hair in and of itself is bad, but think of all the other things, the kinds of food you eat, the things you drink, how much you can drink. I mean, I would say that's a popular thing in at least young circles in the world. And even, weightlifting, how much you can lift, or how good you are at sports, or how well you know football teams, there are endless things that I can name as examples that people would say, oh yeah, that's being a man, or being able to fix cars, or being able to repair your house, or anything. And again, it's not to say that there can't be value in those different things, but are we putting value on those things for being manly, or just because there's value in them? Because at the end of the day, God doesn't care if you have all of that if you're missing these 2 things, which is courage and loyalty. So again, machoism and machismo, that is not what makes you a man. The second of these weaknesses or perversions is being effeminate. Again, being effeminate. We see that in 1 Corinthians 6:9. And as promised, I'm dragging it out a little bit, so I'm just going to keep moving. You don't have to turn to all of these, but I'll read them anyway. 1 Corinthians 6:9, he says, "Or do you not know that the unrighteous will not inherit the kingdom of God? Do not be deceived. Neither the sexually immoral, nor idolaters, nor adulterers, nor men who practice homosexuality." What's interesting is that, or what I want to highlight is that last part, nor men who practice homosexuality. Well, there's actually two Greek terms that are put right there that are both mashed up into that one term, which you can see that, at least I have it in mine, a footnote. It says the two Greek terms translated by this phrase. So even they're telling you there are two phrases there. Well, one of them is malakoi, and the definition of that is to be soft, metaphorically speaking. It's like when Jesus is talking about John the Baptist, and he says, "What did you go out to see? A man dressed in soft clothing." And that term is, and I'm sorry, I meant to mention too, if you have a NAS Bible, at least an older one, it should actually have that broken out, homosexuals, but then also effeminate. There should actually be a separate, not category, but term there for it. And again, that's to be, that term, effeminate, malakoi, soft, to be limp-wristed, wimpy, lacking toughness, or given to what God has attached to the identity of women. And the key thing not to miss in relation to this term, it is not the same as one displaying homosexual behavior. And I think that is how we think of it, is we're like, well, if somebody's being effeminate, we associate that more with being homosexual. That's not the case here. A man can be effeminate and not homosexual or gay. Again, there are two Greek terms here. The other one is much harder to pronounce, and I'm not going to try. But the other one is what's translated as homosexual. And both of those terms show up in 1 Corinthians 6:9. Just as it was in Paul's day, many men today who are otherwise heterosexual are, by definition, effeminate in their behavior. They are men who are feelings-based versus fact-based, men who are easily offended, men whose feelings are easily hurt, men who are always feeling sorry for themselves or who possess thin skin. They're men who are always crying, whining, complaining, and playing the victim. They're men who are always making excuses, men who never take ownership or responsibility but blame everything on others. They're men who get mad when people call them out, men who are drawn to weakness and an I can't attitude. It's also men with long hair. We've seen this a bunch of times with 1 Corinthians 11:14. Our natural or God-given intuition should teach us that long hair is attached to women, irrespective of what we see in the culture, which means it shouldn't be a conflict to you when you see, because there are guys out there who look manly according to the world standards. They have big muscles, or they don't talk with a weird voice, or whatever you want to say, but they have long hair. That shouldn't be a conflict to you. That's still effeminate by definition. They don't have to be homosexual to still be effeminate. But even, again, what we're focused on here is inward focus of the church. And people can be effeminate but not homosexual. And again, though the world today has done much to destroy true manliness, it at the same time still looks down and even makes fun of men who are effeminate, lacking toughness, easily offended, or always making excuses, whining, or complaining. One of my favorite examples is in David Goggins' book, one of these like Navy SEAL guys that wrote a book. He talks about the Navy SEAL instructors. And these guys, when they were making excuses, lacking toughness, or whatever, they would make fun of them. They would mock them in a little bit harsher terms, but as men with sand in their vaginas. And those are the kinds of terms they would use to drive them away from that. So again, even the world understands these kinds of distinctions and pushes against that. So again, those first two, the last of these weaknesses or perversions, is being a fickle malcontent. Again, being a fickle malcontent. And I would make note of, too, sometimes it takes stronger language to drive people away from stuff. And we see this even in, like, how we protect. I can relate to hiking 14ers because sometimes there's animals that will come up and try to chew your brake lines. And the way you protect against that, in some cases, is you use stuff that will make it taste or smell bad. And so we use that kind of in this like animal kingdom, but we think we're more sophisticated than that. Well, sometimes all it takes is a perspective change for you to go away from something. If you change your perspective to realize that something is bad enough that you don't want to be associated with that, that will drive you away from that. Sometimes that's what strong language does. That's why swear words can be important. So again, tangent, back to the point here. So being a fickle malcontent, Jude 1:16. Again, verse 16, he makes mention of these are grumblers, malcontents, following their own sinful desires. It's just really those first two terms I want to pick up. They're grumblers and malcontents. Other places it's people who find fault. Well, if you think about those two terms, they're actually really, really similar. I mean, somebody who's finding fault is probably not going to be a very content person. They're going to be a malcontent. And so, again, the reason I'm saying a fickle malcontent is because the people who are always dissatisfied or looking for problems or are never content in the position they're in, those are the kinds of people that are going to be really, really fickle. And that's not an option. If you're going to act like a man, you do not get to be that kind of person. It's just some characteristics that may fit these kinds of people. It's men that have no loyalty, are quitters, are always dissatisfied or feeling underappreciated. It's always being ready to quit if they're not getting their way. Always finding fault, being nonconformists, having bad attitudes, not being a team player, not taking orders or respecting authority structures. They're always bucking the rules or questioning things. And they're loyal only to self and their ideas, and they hate being under the authority or ideas of others. So again, like I said, I'll keep saying it, we do not get the option to do that. That is not like one characteristic that you get to pick and choose if you want to be that kind of person. If you're going to act like a man the way God sees it, you will not be a fickle malcontent, period. And again, don't get tripped up. Jesus saw the fault with the church and was loyal anyway, whereas the grumbler finds fault and allows that to cause disloyalty. And as a man, our loyalty is irrespective of the faithfulness or imperfection or whatever it is. And I would still argue, when we talk about being a fickle malcontent, it's finding fault with stuff that's really, really stupid. And that's more the issue and I've seen it in workplaces too, where people are they always have a problem with everything that management is doing. They're never good with it. They always think that there's a better way to do it. I saw that. I think the fast food industry, restaurant industry is great because there's a lot of people who have made it to their 30s and 40s and they're still at restaurants, and they think they know way better than all the restaurant management. And that's not always true. So again, Jesus saw the legitimate fault, let me put it that way, with the church and was loyal anyway. So again, the result of men not being men, but instead cowards, effeminate, and malcontents, is a society filled with what we see in Isaiah 3:12. Infants will be their oppressors, and women will be their rulers. It's a society filled with child idolatry and feminism. And understand, too, just like I said, it's not an option to be any of these things. Cowards, the effeminate, and malcontents go to hell. And that comes from Revelations 21-8. The cowardly, their portion is in the lake of fire. 1 Corinthians 6:9, like we saw, the effeminate, they will not inherit the kingdom of God. Jude 1:16 with verse 4, right where we're at right now. Certain people have crept in unnoticed who long ago were designated for this condemnation. They are ungodly people who pervert the grace of our God into sensuality and deny our only Master and Lord, Jesus Christ. Cowards, the effeminate, and malcontents go to hell. One last clarification. Acting like a man is not something a male human being waits to do until he gets married or becomes an adult. Just like elders, you don't become an elder and then become all the things that an elder is supposed to be. You become, or rather, you work towards being what an elder should be. That's what makes you eligible to become an elder. Well, the same is true here, going back to where we started. The command to act like men is not age-determined or defined. God expects everyone born a male from the time they are born to begin acting like a man. This is the direction parents should be pushing their male children from the beginning, which means not allowing them to be sissies or cry or act fearful all the time. These are learned traits. And if parents aren't teaching and pushing their boys in the direction of what God says a man is to act like, then what they should expect to have are boys acting like little girls. It's just that simple. And I'm not coming at this, with all due respect, I'm not coming at this as a parent, but let me make an appeal as a ex-kid. At some point, your kids will go into the real world, and they will either be ready for it or they will not be ready for it. That is determined by you. They're in your 18-year training camp, and they will either be ready to go into the world or they won't. And I've heard examples of kids who have no ability to problem solve. They're hit with the smallest problems and just undone. And that's not a good thing. Your kids should be cutting their teeth all the time on little decisions that have no real impact. They should be problem solving. They should be forced into these positions where they can actually learn these life skills. If you make every decision for your kid until they're 18, you shouldn't be surprised if the only thing your kids are good at is looking to somebody else for the answers. And that, again, that's just my appeal from just growing up and seeing different things. And even like we talked about with the machoism or machismo, no, weightlifting or playing sports or whatever, those aren't necessarily, what make you a man, but those can be really valuable things to train your kids in to be tough. Or, I remember like our dad, he knows how to work on cars really well. And working on cars is not really the easiest thing in the world. Sometimes you should be pushed out of your comfort zone and have to just do something that you're not used to doing. If you let your kids stay in their comfort zones all the time, they're going to be very inflexible people when they go into the world. It's just that simple. And so again, I'm coming at that from not trying to make that appeal as a parent, because I cannot imagine how hard it is to be a parent. But let me just say that as growing up and seeing different things of your kids are either going to be ready or they're not. And unless you're going to chain them in the basement, you don't get the option to just have them until they're dead. So again, our closing challenge for today, to those men in our congregation who found out they are not acting like men, the way God defines it, today's the day to man up. And that should be the best news in the world, because now you know and now you can change. Not only does God want this, but also your wife, your kids, or your future wife, for those of us not yet married. These are important things. If you want to for me, I want to get a wife. This kind of sermon is revealing for me. I see things even in the small. When I go hang out with guys, we will take an hour and a half to decide movies. That's not really a big deal, but at the end of the day, that's a good place to practice. You should be able to make decisions a lot quicker than that. And those are the kinds of small things. It's like, if you practice them in the small things, you'll get that kind of mindset for when you have to make bigger decisions. And same with the discernment too with your kids. If your kids can't figure out really, really small things or make really small decisions, you shouldn't be surprised when they have no ability to discern bigger problems or work through spiritual things. Again, just reflections from my own life. I know I'm a young guy, but take it with a grain of salt, but hear it for what it's worth. So again, today is the day to man up, and we should be better for it. Let's close with a word of prayer. Father, I thank you once again for this time that you've given us just to be together in your house and just learn your truth, Father. I pray that the things I've said today would resonate with people. I pray that they would reflect on them. And I pray, Father, that I didn't have any inaccuracies, but, Father, that people would be faithful to shore those up with Pastor if there are any. And, Father, I just pray for the rest of this week that we would be most especially, Father, the men in this congregation, that we would be reflective on this, that we would thoroughly examine our lives and see if there are any areas that we need to shore these up, because we want to be pleasing to you as men and leaders, Father. And again, I just thank you for this day, and we just pray a blessing on the rest of it. It's in your Son's name.